Yeah, hello everyone. This is the last event of the Theory Center this semester, and we have a very different concept that we had before, or we are, constantly trying out new formats. And the idea of today's event is to have an external guest and to put the external guest into conversation with people from the department. And this is the first time that we tried out, so I'm really looking forward to this, how it will, how things will unfold about this. And also last time when we had just a regular presentation, and then we heard about approaches which try to move beyond narrativism and in history. And today we are going to explore what's left in narrativism, or what narrativism has still to offer to our understanding of history. And it's going to be Kalle Pihlainen who is going to talk about this, and the occasion is Kalle's book, which got recently published. But first, a few words about Kalle, who's at the moment a senior research fellow at Tallinn University at the School of Humanities, also an adjunct professor of philosophy and cultural theory at Åbo Academy, which is a Swedish-speaking university in Finland, and an adjunct professor in political history and philosophy of history at the University of Turku. He's also, from this year on, the editor-in-chief of Rethinking History, together with Patrick Finney, and they took over the journal from Alan Manslow this year. He's also the author of around, let's say, 50 articles, either in journals or in anthologies, like New Literary History or the Sage Handbook for Historical Theory. And he published actually 3 books last year, 2 edited volumes, entitled History in the World and Futures for the Past. These are 2 different volumes. And the book that we are actually going to talk about, or the ideas related to this book, called The Work of History, and the discussion partners will be Lars Deile, Britta Hockirchen, and Paula Dill, whom I guess you know. Oh yeah, and the way we proceed is that Kalle is going to have sort of an introduction for, let's say, 15 minutes, and then our discussion partners are going to reflect in 5 minutes, and then we are not going to have actually internal discussion. We will just right away go and discuss the entire room. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me at the back. I'm not very good at projecting, so someone put up your hand if I start to mumble and you lose me. First, I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here. I like the format. I think it's incredibly generous and considerate that people actually will read something I've written, and then I can just come and chat about it. And I'm very thankful. I'm looking forward to the feedback and the discussion itself. So it's very gracious of you, and thank you, Zoltan, for planning and executing everything related to the event. It's wonderful to be here. I was going to have a PowerPoint now. As you see, it's a PDF because of some technical difficulties, but it's the same content, so it should be all right. I will start with actually, I will say something first. The book is not about Hayden White per se, which is why he said he shouldn't be in the title when he commented on it. I had him in the title for the idea that it would sell better, but it really is not about White in the sense that it's sort of looking at the misunderstandings related to that debate of the last 40, 50 years, and then saying what might be left, what kind of mileage we might have left in that debate.
Actually, I don't understand you very well. If you could be a bit more slow, maybe, or
I shall
more precise, because
okay.
Otherwise about 30% don't get
Ouch.
to me.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
One problem is that I'm not used to speaking while standing, so I'll have to try and do it sitting down, which is again a matter of problem for projecting. Anyway, so the book is really looking at. No, I'm really bad at doing that, so I would prefer to sit down if possible, and I can't really do 2 things at once. So, there's been a 40, 50-year debate about narrativism, as you know, initiated by Hayden White, and the point here is to, in contrast to a lot of debates about post-narrativism, to say what might be left, what might be useful still in narrativism, And I do that by, in the chapter some of you might have read, by first looking at the misunderstandings, some of the misunderstandings going on in the debate, and I will rehash some of those here quickly. But I want to start off with a quotation from White, and even though I said it's not a book about White, all the quotations are about White that I'm presenting you here. So he writes, this is one of the very controversial early comments, provocations he makes. He says, "Consider historical narratives as what they most manifestly are, verbal fictions, the contents of which are as much invented as found, and the forms of which have more in common with their counterparts in literature than they have with those in the sciences." And I think this introduces already a lot of persistent misunderstandings in the debate, and those persistent misunderstandings generally relate to epistemological issues. So in my book I don't devote so much time to the epistemological challenges because they are fairly straightforward from the research side of historians' work. Historians are very good at establishing the facts, and I'll come to that. But for some reason the discussion always returns to questions of epistemology, partly because of these kinds of provocations, but I'll try and nuance some of the discussion here. So some of the persistent misunderstandings, we'll have another quote here immediately. So this is White again writing, "As for the notion of a true story, this is virtually a contradiction in terms. All stories are fictions, which means of course that they can be true only in a metaphorical sense, and in the sense in which a figure of speech can be true." And then he asks, is this true enough? Again, this is the debate which keeps cropping up, that fiction is somehow opposed to fact rather than something constructed. And a lot of the misunderstandings relate or can be reused back to this. So the first misunderstanding that I discuss in the book a lot is this idea of stories being in reality. And that's an epistemology issue. White and any constructivist would say stories don't exist in reality as such. They may exist in our projection onto that reality and so on. So truth in the sense of meaning is not something which is out there, as Richard Rorty makes that point classically in the 90s already. And this is against claims still by people like Alistair MacIntyre, even 15 years ago, David Carr in his recent book a few years ago, and then a lot of proponents picking up on this idea that because we experience things or we tell things to ourselves in the form of stories, and stories are somehow existing in the world and all we have to do is discover them. So this is one part where White comes strongly against this, or narrative constructivism in this sense is very strongly opposed to the idea of truth out there, stories in reality and so on. And a different way of putting that in our discussion quite often is this idea that there's no entailment from facts to values. This is a point made by Keith Jenkins, one of the major theorists also. And that simply means, of course, that from any set of facts you cannot derive the meaning. The meaning isn't in them, out there again in the same sense. And we have some thought experiments from the 90s which are quite interesting for this. There's one by Raymond Martin in History and Theory where he poses the idea that if we had all the facts, would we not know then how things were? And that's a tempting, intuitively tempting idea, that if we just collect all the related facts, then we will have somehow gathered meaning, we can draw on that interpretation, or we can found that interpretation somehow. Now, these are the epistemological misunderstandings I think people still sometimes have, not on a theorized, sophisticated level, but in their practical work. And these are some things that I discuss in the first chapter of the book a bit. But the more crucial misunderstandings, I think, are to do with narrativism. Because of these provocations by White, then a lot of the misunderstanding relating to what narrativism means return to this idea that it's an anti-realist position. So you go to the other extreme, you say, narrativists do not believe that the world is out there, and that's an absurd proposition, an absurd position to hold. And they're put together with these extreme relativists as anti-realist, even though no one that I've ever seen in the last 100 years actually promotes this kind of philosophical position. And so narrativism is not anti-realism, and for narrativists, history is not just an invention. It's very much grounded in historians' work, grounded in the sort of research. Again, as I said earlier, the work that historians do very well is something that narrativists do not question, but it's the situating of meaning into those research results which is the problem. And I'll come to that a little bit more in a moment. But I think these misunderstandings about narrativism and always lead people to, or critics of narrativism, to not pay enough attention to the fact that it is also something very historical, is not an unhistorical position. So here's another quote from White. This is the idea which is often quite overlooked, that we have all sorts of processes which are outside us, which form or restrict how we can make meanings about reality and so on. And White says, the historian shares with his audience general notions of the forms which significant human situations must take by virtue of his participation in the specific processes of sense-making, which identify him as a member of one cultural endowment rather than another. So it is a historical position in the end. You have to contextualize to understand, and we're all guided by very, very many different constraints in our practices of meaning-making. So it's not this absurd anything-goes position at all. And I will skip discussion of facts because I don't want to go too long. We can come back to that perhaps in the debate. I think it will come up. So anyway, historians are committed to talking about the past truthfully as a result of a genre. White acknowledges that, and all these other generic conventions which relate to the profession. And what I try and do in the book then is to look at how these actually guide the writing of history. So we have the idea that historians have to take in all relevant facts into account, and that this commitment, the commitment for professional sort of checks and balances, discussion, taking in previous accounts and so on, they guide the they impact so much on the form that we can actually read back that form from a history. Now this goes into a lot of literary theory debates with people like Michael Rifferter, who has this idea that any text we can always find the sort of single meaning in there if we're competent enough readers. So it's a very involved literary reading process. I don't want to take it so far, but I do think that we have clear textual markers of historians' commitments to reality, to the genre, when we compare a historical text with, let's say, a perfectly fictional text, because of the ways you make meaning making. I mean, in Harry Potter, you can have someone whose name is significant in a historical account. It might happen, but it will be coincidental, and generally it's not the case. So you don't have all these different semiotic sort of meaning making factors providing one unitary meaning, if you believe in that kind of literary theory or aesthetic theory idea, which a lot of theorists, literary theorists, I think, still do. And that's the argument that I talk about a lot more toward the end of the book. I skipped facts, excuse me.
Second time, right?
Yeah, no, this is relating to that. So yeah, we will come back to that, I'm sure. So I think a lot of these points, one thing which is kind of a misunderstanding or a misreading of narrativism, a lot of these points are not, I think, accepted by so many critics of narrativism because they don't always note that all these narrative constructivists, narrative theorists of history, White, Ankersmit, Keith Jenkins, Alan Munslow, and so on, they all make a clear distinction between the research phase and the writing phase. Not as a practical distinction, but as a heuristic distinction. So they make it very clear they're not talking about historians' research, we're only talking about the writing. And that's why their objections relate so much also to how the history profession, most of us are not teaching our students how to write. That's kind of taken for granted still, and that is what White's critique goes against. I have no idea how much time I have.
It just go on.
Okay, thanks. So for me, constructivism is not a criticism of historians as researchers, and neither is it for White. He's always respectful of the fact that historians are good at finding out things about the past. And again, we'll come back to that in the discussion of facts, I'm sure. But so this critique is more about historians as writers. He has this essay from 1966, which was his first sort of theory essay, and in there he makes this polemical statement that history is just bad art because it doesn't, it's not up to our contemporary literary sensibilities. It's not interesting for readers. It follows very 19th century realist novel conventions and so on. And his challenge to historians, to me, is not really about whether history is fiction or not, but it really is why history. What's the purpose of history? And I just want to give another quote from him, which again is him, I think, at his most provocative, where he suggests that history is something we don't necessarily need. It's not natural is not something which belongs to human nature as such, as a discipline, not as a way of historicizing ourselves in our context and so on. So he writes, historians of his generation must be prepared to face the possibility that the prestige which their profession enjoyed among 19th century intellectuals was a consequence of determinable cultural forces. They must be prepared to entertain the notion that history, as currently conceived, is a kind of historical accident, a product of a specific historical situation, and that with the passing of the misunderstandings that produced that situation, history itself may lose its status as an autonomous and self-authenticating mode of thought. And now here's the challenge. It may well be that the most difficult task which the current generation of historians will be called upon to perform is to expose the historically conditioned character of the historical discipline. Now this is written in the early 70s already. I think 74 was the first version of this essay, so it's not for that generation anymore. It might be for the next generation, our generation, I don't know. But Keith Jenkins, who takes these arguments much further, he makes a nice, very short formulation of this argument. He says history is just like Latin. You know, at one point it was important, and then it's not spoken anymore. There's no natural reason for us to keep going on with it. And so this all relates to the what I call the epistemological debate, the sort of empirical questions surrounding these debates. And for me, the more important thing, which I try and discuss more in the book, is not epistemology. It's this question of why do we need history? What's it for? A lot of theorists are presenting, a lot of people are presenting good arguments for why history is oppressive, why it's it's used for power purposes and so on. So why do we need it? What legitimates history? Why just not end with history, as Jenkins says? And Jenkins, again, he's very good at making short polemical suggestions. So another suggestion, or another way he makes his point, is to say that history is promiscuous. It will go with anyone, in his words. So anyone can use history for whatever purpose they want. What do we need this for any more than we have? Or why not just instead resort to philosophical, literary, cinematic, different kinds of ways of thinking about the future and the past, which enable us to do other things, maybe in an emancipatory way. And these are the polemical arguments that these theorists make. And I think that, we'll come to that, I'm sure, in the discussion. So, this is White's argument for this moralizing tendency of history, or the idea that history can be used for anyone, and how it relates to the literary writing. So he says that when it's a matter of recounting the concourse of real events, whatever ending could a given sequence of such events have than a moralizing ending. And this is just to point out that closure always imposes some meaning on whatever we're talking about, and that meaning is, as you all know from reading the 90s debates, is always somehow ideological, whether conscious or not. And this is, to me, the point where this discussion moves from the epistemological debate to the ethical, political debate, because then you cannot talk about, or it's not interesting to talk only about epistemology, because that's not the only thing historians are involved with. When they move to writing their accounts, and they move this discussion away from, or at least also into the ethical, political dimension. Okay, thanks. Now the problem with thinking of history in the sense that it can be used for any purpose, then even if we accept these arguments, as a lot of feminists were saying in the 90s, that this universalization of difference was something which was welcomed by a lot of middle-aged men, because it gives them the opportunity to say, all views are equal, and there's, we are the ones in this position, and we make decisions, but all, It disempowers people, because if you say all views are equal, someone still has more power than others, and then it takes away the opportunity to resist that power. There's an argument Nancy Fraser made beautifully in the 1990s. I don't want to rehash that here, but so the problem with understanding this only as a relativist proposition is that then it disempowers. So that's why Jenkins' option is just to say, let's end with history instead of having these debates. But what options do we have for history is a question that I'm trying to discuss toward the end of the book, if that is indeed the case, that history can be used for any purpose, and usually the dominant interpretation is the one which is already attached to the centers of power and so on. So one when you see the link between the form and the ethical impetus, the written form and the ethical impetus, then one answer that I try and develop a little bit is just that we could avoid closure. Now there are literary means, there are performance studies means, performance theory means, performative means, let's say, theatrical means and so on for avoiding closure. And that's something I discuss more in the book, and since Zoltan told me I have to stop, I will soon. Yeah. So I will just list quickly a few of the other ways that I try and argue might help us in countering the difficulties with this kind of closed moralizing form, which is somehow always in the service of dominant ideologies because of the discipline of history, how it's institutionalized and so on. So one argument I try and develop a lot in the book is that we should see histories perhaps as disturbed narratives. This idea that the form is always compromised by these genre commitments. And to think of history in those terms, then you could say that if we embrace this idea of disruption, that we take into consideration all the facts, and that how somehow disrupts the aesthetic form, then we might then take this further. And we could do something as in performance, for example, where you intentionally use reality to disrupt that form. And you try and get away from these kinds of closures, ideological closures and so on. So that's one argument I try and make. Another argument that I try and make is that facts should not be fetishized in the way that they are, that somehow if something is real, it happened, it's factual, it gives it somehow more importance than something which didn't happen. Now we have beautiful anecdotes of this. A colleague of ours has been visiting recently the site of the Battle of Hastings, and he was there. All his other people on the bus had beautiful historical experiences, and they were really sort of feeling the past and so on. And then a few years later, or a year later, he read in the newspapers how the Battle of Hastings actually didn't take place in that field which they visited, but somewhere else. So again, to question some of these, let's say, romanticizing ways of thinking about the past and how they impact on people working in the discipline, perhaps, as well. And so the solution I try and offer toward the end of the book is just this idea of some post-structuralist theorists suggest this explosion of representational entities. So this is a very formal question, that you just have so much, let's say, facts, data, like Natalie Zeman-Davis' Fiction in the Archives, where the historian doesn't intervene as much in the written form, but let's say let the materials speak for themselves. Difficult idea, but a possibility, especially if it's done in the way where there's so much that the interpretation is really shifted more onto the reader, and the historian becomes more aware of the ethical, political consequences of what they're doing, and tries perhaps to intervene less. Again, one qualification I make in the book throughout is that these are all, as White also, when he talks about modernist form, he suggests that we have to be on the cutting edge. So history is bad art. So I don't want to be prescriptive in these suggestions, but just to say that these are some ways which might, with our current reading sensibilities, literary sensibilities, aesthetic sensibilities, they might work for a while to prevent some of these closures. And the downside, of course, is that these kinds of forms would be extremely boring to read. So it's not a perfect solution by any means. And then we again come back to this idea of the end of history. And the one other big point that I try and make in the book is that all this, because of the way the, let's say, aesthetic or the formal and the empirical or the epistemological and the ethical political tie together or are intermingled, then this is always, all of these questions are also ethical political issues. And the answer that I try and provide in the book, I'm sure I'll get a lot of criticism for this, is that the only way we can deal with this is with a post-structuralist or a consequentialist kind of ethics, where the historian becomes aware that they're in front of, let's say, an aporia with regard to knowledge. They have to make a decision, they have to sort of be in that moment existentially, and they have to provide some kind of intervention, but they have to do it with a view to somehow affecting the kinds of changes they want and to feel, let's say, happy in their responsibility of what they're doing. But I'm sure we'll get to a lot of these in the discussion, so I don't want to go on anymore.